Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the final day of this program. I won't spend much time introducing our two speakers. If you don't know them by now, I don't know where you've been. We have Robin Cohen from a local boy from Oxford, but also a member of the South African diaspora, and then Uma Kotari, who has joined us from Manchester. Both established sort of groundbreaking academics who've, and now it's going to sound bad, who've been at it for quite a while, but and have made I think quite a substantial contribution for those of us working on migration, but have also in their own respective fields, I think, established the value of migration studies as something that can help reshape a broader thinking about the nature of society and politics, development, and the like. The theme, which is appropriate given the journey we've been on for this session, is about the journey, I think. And so they'll both be speaking about that for about half an hour, and if all goes well, we should have plenty of time for questions before the fire alarm tells us to go get coffee. So we'll start with Robin, and he'll introduce his topic, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Initially, this session for this morning was anchored around three words: diaspora, transnationalism, identity. And by a sort of strange quirk of fate, both Uma and I thought, how does one actually address those three themes? And I scratched around a little bit and thought, well, perhaps one optic or one prism through which one could see all three is the journey. And by the oddest coincidence, Uma's just said, oh yeah, she's doing something on the journey too, so you're going to have a double dose. I'm sure that we'll be saying somewhat different things, but let's see how this all rolls out. So I started first by thinking about the journey in literature and noticed that it's quite an extraordinary recurring theme. So something that might be considered perhaps the first novel in Western Europe, Homer's Odyssey, is of course about a journey, somebody who leaves seeking adventure, seeking new grounds, and so on. James Joyce writes his famous book Ulysses, which of course is the Latin word for Odysseus, in this case, somebody who has a journey around his city, a journey more in his imagination, a journey meeting people in one day, a very large book, which I'm sure not all of us have read cover to cover, but there are some very interesting passages in which he begins to echo other journeys, other salient journeys. So he talks at one point in a reflective way about the Irish going across the sea to the United States in these coffin ships. And of course, this is a direct literary and historical allusion to the African slave trade. Those ideas of people getting into a ship more or less like a set of coffins. I'm sure you've all seen the images. And that's all in James Joyce. And then, of course, medieval knights rode large distances in search of the Holy Grail. And I woke up this morning with a start and said to my good wife, do you know what the Holy Grail is, in fact? And I realize I've been using this word, this expression, a long time, but it turns out to be the plate or perhaps the cup that was used in the Last Supper, so a holy relic, in search of a holy relic. Or a slightly odder character in literature, Don Quixote, depicted here on this image in the famous Pablo Picasso image of this man who is somewhat knight-like. He seeks also some holy grail, but it's rather mystical, it's rather odd. He's not quite sure where he's going. He also struggles to establish what the purpose of his journey is. And at some points he thinks that the windmills, who you can just see on the image there, are enemies, and so he gets his lance and he rides towards the windmills trying to spear them out of existence. So maybe that can be used metaphorically or analogously. And of course, figures like Dick Whittington, Robinson Crusoe, all about the journey in the literary imagination. One might then switch to another area where there are discussions of the journey in religion. And we notice that this is a very recurring theme in most religions, perhaps all religions. I haven't really checked this systematically. When Muhammad and his followers move from Mecca to Medina, when there's an exodus of the Jews from Egypt to the promised land, and even that those expressions, Exodus, the first book of the Bible, the promised land, these expressions get used over and over again in migration literature. And so I think there are at least 3 or 4 books describing the United States as the promised land, and as using this biblical analogy. And of course the Holy Family's movement following the birth of Jesus, pilgrimages in Christianity, and the Buddha's search for enlightenment, which is depicted there in the image. So the Lord Buddha, moves on this journey. He meets this beggar, he meets a skeleton, he goes through various people along the way. And of course, perhaps the most interesting in terms of numbers is the Hajj. Now, this is a massive event. For the last 10 years, the Hajj has never had fewer than 2 million people arriving for the few days of ceremony. And 1 year, about 3 years ago, it had over 3 million people. So when we see these very large numbers, large quote unquote, of people moving to Europe and so on, we just take that one little image, and I couldn't quite resist that rather photographically beautiful image of the Hajj again. That has no additional significance in terms of what I wanted to say. Now, what about in our own literature, in the migration literature? Well, I think perhaps the most interesting, article, and thanks Nick van Heer, who I think is here, for giving me this reference, is written by Gadi Benazar and our colleague at Oxford, Roger Zeta, in the Journal of Refugee Studies. The reference is on the slide. Now, they sort of infer that this is rather peculiar and particular to refugees, but in fact, I think we could probably see that there are quite a number of the features that are there described are part of the journeys that migrants go through in general. So you have events that are powerful and life-changing. And I suppose maybe this happened to Uma as it did to me. Those nightly iterations of the Mediterranean migrants and the migrants across the Eastern Balkans and the pictures of people moving have somehow brought this whole thing back, the idea of a life-changing event that is happening on the journey. And this extraordinary sense in which people, as they move, are constructing new identities. And they are both echoing back, with this case, the help of technology, smartphones, back to their families and saying, I'm moving from this place to that place. They try to locate where they are using GPS technology, and they try to anticipate where they're going to by texting or speaking to families or relatives or networks in intended countries. And so the journey has become almost an accelerated form of transnational construction in which you might observe some of these elements. Now, there are all kinds of examples that are given here and important points that are made on the slide. But I wanted to just draw attention to 2 or 3. Benazar refers back to his earlier work on Ethiopian Jews, which is, I think, a very interesting example of a group that was rather insecure in its historical identity because it had been separated from other segments of Jewry for a long, long time. And in recovering the journey and making the journey from Ethiopia to Israel, they then are able to echo back to the Exodus story and say, yes, we are Jews after all. We have an identity because we're going through the same process that they went through. We are also having these arduous journeys, also these difficulties, and we are going towards the promised land. And this idea of anticipating the destination, I think, is very important because, as I think we'll imply in that last point, if you're anticipating a particular place where you will be going or might be ending up, you're beginning to start that journey in your mind before you've ever made that first step. And so the whole question arises of when does the journey start? A rather interesting proposition. How do people think about it? And there's a lovely expression that's gone out of fashion in old sociologists used to use the expression anticipatory socialization, and it works quite well here because what you're thinking of is how will I fit into that place which I've imagined I will be in. And you can see this in the journeys of people through the Balkans, where they go through Macedonia. Never heard of it, I don't know this place, so I'm going to Germany. So there are places where they could stop, but they don't stop, because in their imagination, they're going somewhere else. They've already constructed their destination. Okay, so, and of course they meet new companions, they have all sorts of adventures, all sorts of misfortunes, they have all kinds of solidarity and community that develops as they're making their journey. And that idea, I think, is quite interesting in itself. So if we move from those observations and thinking about the literary and the religious tradition, I want to suggest that there's a sense in which those are not merely non-migration issues or non-migration ways of seeing the journey, but that they enter the popular imaginary. They enter that imaginary and are replicated through popular culture. And in this case, the example of Cape Verdean music, and the famous Cesare Avara, sadly no longer with us. And one of the musicians, I forget whether it's her or somebody else, defined this lament, which is quite common in Ireland and Scotland, in the Fado in Portugal. There are various other cultures, I think, in which this is quite a common thing. This lament for somebody who is lost, who is gone, who you miss. And that sense in which the Morna, the popular song that the song that she popularized, the form of song that she popularized so much, is how migration has deeply entered the culture of the country and the imagination of the culture of the country. It's not just the people who have gone. It's not just the people who anticipate or expect to go. It's also the people who have stayed. So the ones who've stayed and want to go, and the ones who want to go and have to stay. That kind of conjuncture, that sense in which there's a dialectical connection between the stayers and the goers, which I think we haven't quite captured yet because we've been too focused on the migrants, the movers. And a lot of people are now saying, well, what about the stayers? And I think we've got a paper on that in the conference. But I think even more interesting is what is the relationship in a deep sense between the stayers and the goers. Now, obviously, we have people working on the theme in a general sense, but I think we need a little bit more specificity there. So what I'm suggesting here is we get a creation of a migration culture or a culture of migration, which grips the popular imagination, which defines what people will want to do or expect to do or need to do in making their journey or planning their journey, but also in a more subtle social sense, who they have continuing obligations to. Is this the moment to dump the boyfriend? Or is this the moment to say goodbye to the oppressive family? Or is this the moment when you decide you need those relationships, you need to sustain those relationships and keep them going? So, of course, the reason why culture is important is for all kinds of reasons, but one of the things that I think is fairly salient is that there's quite a lot of evidence now that these migration cultures persist through time pretty well, not completely, but pretty well irrelevantly ignoring the economic signals as irrelevant. So this idea that many economists have that migration is, as it were, market sensitive, that somebody will say, oh, not enough employment, the wage levels have gone down between place A and place B. It may affect to some degree destinations, but it really affects volume. And so I think migration cultures are, I think, very, very important to understand in that sense. All right, now, pressing on, I think one of the forms of movement that we, of course, are often talk about is the return journey, and the sense in which, one, we've ignored one or two successful returns, and I've just put on the slide, we often forget because we think Afghanistan is a total basket case, that over 3 million people have been resettled there, which is quite a significant event that we need to talk about and think about. It's not an insubstantial victory for some of our colleagues in the UNHCR and elsewhere, and I think that's worth thinking about. But also that the kind of static ideas of, there's a one-way ticket going from place A to place B, or there's a one-way return ticket going back to the same place, that's becoming, if you like, less and less common. And what is becoming more and more frequent is oscillating movement, circulating movement, and movements that are, if you like, in a voluntary sense, much more complex. However, I also want to draw attention to a new twist in the return story, which is about to take place in the EU. That is to say, a movement of public opinion which has determined the politicians on a forcible return deportation policy. Not very effective, I think. Maurizio made this point. Up to now, only about half the people who issued deportation orders, I think he said, in Italy, actually go back. But now there's a new determination, and it's masked under this expression, humane return. And humane return means rounding up people and sending them back home forcibly. But more interestingly, it's also involved doing deals with governments who are meant to take these returnees. And you're already beginning to see the shape of the argument. So I think it was the Somalian Prime Minister who said, yes, sounds like a good idea, and you're offering, was it 10 million? Not enough. So we're getting a kind of bargaining beginning to develop around how many people have to be deported and how, on the other side, the states have to be compensated. Now, of course, we all love unintended consequences in migration studies. That's our meat. That's our bread and butter. And you can just see this one coming down the road because you are creating a perverse incentive for governments to say, let's have more and more returnees because we get paid. So if in order to have more and more returnees, we have to send more and more. So we've now got a nice little unvirtuous cycle beginning, which will no doubt happen very shortly. So some concluding points then. Using the journey as an optic to understand transnationalism, diaspora, identity, gives us, I think, some kind of way which is not interrogating the concepts. Of course, I think that's probably where I would have normally started, but I decided, well, no, maybe doing it in a slightly different way would just give us a kind of a feel for what's going on here, rather than a sort of interrogating the concepts abstractly. And looking at how transnationalism is made in real circumstances, in real time, by families, by returning for carnivals, for family occasions, for Christmas, showing for religious festivals, Diwali, and so on, shows how these transnational connections are transmitted intergenerationally. And of course, it's a bit like what Peggy Levitt was talking about in social remittances, but I think you can make that a little bit more concrete in that way. And I think if you're interested in diasporic studies, the journey is crucially important because it has that kind of way of forging the memory. It's not just the memory of the initial oppression, it's the memory of the journey. So if you think of African slavery and the powerful growth of an African diaspora in the New World, what is that memory? It's exactly what James Joyce said. It's the coffin ships. That's what lodges in people's minds. That is what constitutes it. What constituted the story of the exile of the Jews to Babylon? It's the leaders being blinded and being dragged off in chains to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Actually, despite the bad press that Babylon got, it wasn't such a bad place. They managed to live there for 14 centuries, which is quite a good record for most old civilizations, and they thrived and prospered. So it was the journey, it was blinding people and dragging them from chains. That was the thing. And ditto, the Irish, the potato famine, all of those, the idea that people had to be transshipped, the memory of those ships that got into New York Harbor to Ellis Island with the rich people on the top who were first landed in Manhattan, and the rest of the people were landed on Ellis Island where they had to be processed, and that miserable time they had down in the decks. So it's part of that mythology that creates a diaspora in the first place. And finally, we're beginning to see how identities are being forged on the move. So they're not just there, they're not just inherited. We know they are socially constructed. Everybody makes that point over and over again. That's absolutely true. But there's an interesting argument about where they are socially constructed. And it seems to me quite a lot of that happens on the journey itself. So thanks very much.